The pen felt heavier than it should have. Tessa Hargrove remembered thinking that. How strange it was, the weight of something so small. A ballpoint pen, navy ink, the kind you find in a hotel lobby or a doctor's waiting room. And yet when her hand moved across the bottom of that paper, it felt like she was pressing through concrete. Her lawyer had placed the documents on the glass table at 9:14 in the morning. She remembered the time because the clock on the wall behind Brendan's head had a second hand that ticked loudly, and she'd been staring at it for most of the meeting, trying to anchor herself to something real. Something that didn't move. Brendan Ashford didn't look at her when she signed. He was already on his phone. They had been married for 6 years. The drive home, to her sister's spare bedroom in Oakville, not the condo in downtown Toronto that had been hers for 4 years, and then theirs, and then legally his during those 3 weeks of paperwork, took 40 minutes on the QEW. She didn't cry until she hit the construction slowdown near Mississauga. Then she cried the way people do when they've been holding it so long, their body stops asking permission. She pulled off at a Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot for 22 minutes. She knew because the double-double went cold, and she hadn't taken a single sip. She was 37 years old. She was 3 months pregnant with twins, and the man who had been her husband since she was 31 didn't know or didn't want to know. She wasn't sure anymore which one was worse. Tessa had tried to tell him 3 weeks before he filed. She had made dinner, something real, not Uber Eats, had set the table properly, had practiced the words in the car on the way home from her OB appointment. Brendan, we're having twins. I know the timing is complicated. I know things between us have been. He hadn't come home for dinner. He texted at 11:15, staying at the office, don't wait up. She'd eaten alone, put the leftovers in the fridge, and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time before she understood that the office he was staying at had an address in Liberty Village and a name she recognized. Courtney Vane, 29 years old. A commercial photographer he'd hired for a brand campaign the previous spring. Tessa had actually liked her, the one time they met at a company event. She'd complimented Tessa's jacket. When the divorce papers arrived 11 days later, there was a note from Brendan's lawyer about the NDA, $50,000. In exchange for not discussing the circumstances of the separation publicly. Her own lawyer, a woman named Ruth who wore sensible shoes and never sugarcoated anything, had looked at Tessa across her desk and said, "You don't have to sign that, and I'd strongly suggest you don't." Tessa signed it anyway. She was too tired to fight. She told herself she'd fight later. The twins were born on a Thursday in February. Her sister Megan was there, which meant her brother-in-law was also in the building, pacing the maternity ward waiting room with a coffee he couldn't drink because his hands were too unsteady. Tessa found that out afterward, and it made her love him a little more than she already did. Her mother had taken a flight from Halifax the week before and was staying in Megan's guest room, which meant Tessa had been displaced to the pull-out couch, and she had never slept better in her life because she was so exhausted by that point that she could have slept standing up in a bus shelter. She named the boys Noah and Eli. Brendan was not at the hospital. Brendan was, according to an Instagram story that Megan showed Tessa, 2 days later, with the careful hesitation of someone handing over something potentially explosive, at a private resort in Tofino with Courtney. There were photographs of the two of them on a dock at golden hour. Courtney's hair was very beautiful. Brendan was smiling the way Tessa hadn't seen him smile in probably 2 years. She handed the phone back to Megan and looked at Noah, who was asleep against her chest, making small sounds like a very content old man, and she thought, all right then. She didn't mean it as acceptance. She meant it as a starting point. The first 4 months were the kind of hard that people don't tell you about, because there are no words that fit inside a conversation. It wasn't dramatic hard. It wasn't the kind of hard that makes a good story at a dinner party. It was the hard of 3 a.m. When both babies are crying and you haven't slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch in 12 days and you're sitting on the bathroom floor because where the acoustics don't echo and you're eating.
And a granola bar out of the sink because you forgot to eat dinner and you're crying.
That kind of hard. Tessa's maternity leave ran out in 6 months. She was a structural engineer. She'd worked her way up to project lead at a mid-sized firm in Mississauga. And her company was decent about things, but decent has a limit. She went back half-days at first, then full days, then started picking up the commute on the GO train because Megan lived in Oakville, and the daycare she'd found took both boys starting at 7:30. She did not, during any of this, receive financial support from Brendan. Ruth had told her, repeatedly, that she had grounds, that a man who'd cheated during the marriage and then fled to Tofino while his wife was delivering his children in a hospital 40 minutes away was not going to be looked upon favorably by a family court judge. That Tessa had options. Tessa kept saying, I know, and then not doing anything about it, because doing something about it required energy she was spending on keeping two small people alive and functioning. This was, she would later admit to herself, a mistake. She met Owen Hardcastle on a GO train. She had been going over structural load calculations on her laptop, the kind of focused, slightly dissociative work that she did best in transit. And he'd sat down across from her and pulled out a book, which she noticed because it was a beat-up paperback copy of something her father used to read. She couldn't remember the title now. She remembered looking at it and feeling a small, involuntary pull of recognition, the kind your body makes before your brain has caught up. He didn't say anything to her for the entire ride to Union Station. She found that profoundly pleasant. The second time she saw him, Noah had a fever. She was in the walk-in clinic near the daycare, the one that always smelled vaguely of coffee and hand sanitizer. And she had Eli on her hip and Noah on the paper-covered exam table, and she was explaining the symptoms to the triage nurse while simultaneously trying to keep Eli from pulling over the small, anatomical model of a human ear when the doctor who came in introduced himself as Owen Hardcastle, and she recognized the jacket before she recognized the face. He was thorough and calm and didn't talk to Noah like he was stupid, which Tessa appreciated because her son had very strong opinions about being condescended to, even at 8 months old. He explained the fever was likely viral, gave her the rundown on what to watch for, and then, at the end, said, "You were on the GO train last week, Tuesday, reading load calculations." She stared at him. "I wasn't reading them," he said. "I could just see the headings from where I was sitting. I'm an engineer by training." "I noticed." "You're a doctor," she said. "I switched tracks," he said, which made her laugh despite herself. It was the first time she'd laughed in a while. She noticed that too. He asked for her number. She gave it to him and then spent 4 days convincing herself it was a terrible idea. It was Megan, who finally said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring, "Tessa, you're allowed to have a life. The boys are not going to be harmed by you going for coffee with a man who seems like a decent human being." "I don't know that he's decent," Tessa said. "I know he's a competent pediatrician." "Coffee," Megan said. "One coffee. You can leave whenever you want." The coffee was 3 hours long and ended, because Owen had a morning shift, and she had to get back for the boys' bedtime routine. They talked about structural engineering and the overcrowded state of the Ontario healthcare system, and what it was like to grow up in the Maritimes, which they had both done. Her in Halifax and him just outside of Fredericton. He didn't ask about the boy's father. She didn't volunteer it. There was something mutually understood about the boundaries of a first conversation, and she found it restful in a way she hadn't expected. He texted her when he got home. Noah and Eli are great names. Classic without being overworked. She read it twice, put her phone face down, and smiled at the ceiling. Brendan called in March. She hadn't heard from him in 7 months. She'd gotten used to the silence the way you get used to a sound stopping. You don't notice how present it was until it's gone, and then when it comes back you realize you'd organized your entire life around its absence. "I heard you had kids," he said, like she'd adopted a goldfish. She was standing in her sister's kitchen at 10:30 at night, and her hands went very still. "Twins," she said. "Their names are Noah and Eli. They're 8 months old." There was a pause. "Tessa, you know things between us weren't." "What do you want, Brendan?" Another pause longer. "Courtney and I are engaged. I wanted you to hear it from me." She thought about the Tofino Instagram story, the golden hour doc. His smile that she hadn't seen in 2 years. "Okay," she said. "I also." He stopped. "I want to be in their lives. The boys. I've been thinking about it." She put the phone down on the counter, face up, walked to the window, looked at the street outside for about 30 seconds, then came back and picked it up. "You should talk to my lawyer," she said. "Tessa." "Good night, Brendan." She hung up, and then she called Ruth at 10:45 at night and left a voicemail that said, "He's engaged. He wants custody. We're done waiting. Let's start." Ruth was good at her job. She had the kind of presence in a courtroom that made opposing counsel look like they were shrinking slowly, the way a wool sweater does in a too-hot dryer. She was methodical. She was patient. She had, over the past 8 months, helped Tessa document everything she'd failed to document at the time of the divorce. The texts, the timeline, the photograph evidence of Brendan's absence during the pregnancy, the hospital records that showed his name conspicuously blank on the delivery forms, the financial trail showing that not $1 of support had been transferred to Tessa's account in the 10 months since the birth of his children. Brendan hired a firm out of Bay Street. 2 lawyers, both of them the kind of polish that signals money more than competence. They filed a motion for equal shared custody. They argued that Brendan had been denied meaningful access, which Ruth dismantled quietly and completely by producing the documented timeline of every unreturned call, every unanswered text, every occasion on which Tessa had reached out to inform him of medical appointments, milestones, and the existence of 2 human beings with his genetic material who had learned to pull themselves upright on furniture and were very interested in electrical outlets. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Justice Marisa Okonkwo. She had the kind of face that told you nothing and eyes that told you everything. She read every document. She asked precise questions. The NDA came up. Brendan's lawyers argued it demonstrated Tessa's willingness to resolve matters privately. Ruth argued that a woman 3 months pregnant, in the immediate aftermath of a divorce she didn't initiate, signing away her right to discuss her husband's infidelity in exchange for $50,000, was not a demonstration of equitable negotiation. She had a word for it that she used carefully, once, and let sit in the air of the courtroom. Justice Okonkwo looked at Brendan, over her reading glasses, for a long moment. Tessa didn't look at him at all. She looked at her hands, which were very still in her lap, and she thought about the parking lot of a Tim Hortons in Mississauga, and a double-double going cold, and 22 minutes of sitting alone, and knowing that the next part of her life was starting whether she was ready for it or not. She had not been ready. She was ready now. Owen was not in the courtroom. She hadn't asked him to be, and he hadn't offered, because he understood. In the way that she was beginning to trust, he understood most things, that this particular room was not one she wanted witnessed. Some things you need to do in front of as few eyes as possible. He was, however, parked outside Megan's house when she got back at 4:15, with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that she'd mentioned exactly once in a conversation 3 weeks ago. He handed her one when she got out of the car and didn't ask how it went. He just stood there beside her on the driveway in the February cold while she drank it, and that was enough. "You okay?" he said eventually. "I think so," she said. "I think? Yes, I think I'm okay." She meant it. That was the part that surprised her. She actually meant it. The ruling came 6 weeks later. Primary residence with Tessa. Structured, supervised access for Brendan to begin building a relationship. A real one, the judge specified, which Tessa understood to mean not the one you decided you wanted when it became legally and financially inconvenient not to want it. Monthly support payments retroactive to the boy's birth, calculated against Brendan's actual income, which was considerably higher than the figure his lawyers had initially put forward, and which Ruth had corrected with the methodical patience of someone who had done this many times before. There was also the matter of the NDA. It was, Ruth explained, unenforceable in the context of family court proceedings, and given the circumstances under which it had been signed, which were now part of the public court record, Tessa was no longer bound by it in any meaningful sense. She was free to discuss her experience. She was free to talk about what had happened to her. She didn't have to be quiet anymore. She sat with that for a while. She didn't blow it up publicly. She didn't go on social media. She didn't give interviews or write essays or post anything that could be screenshot and turned into a news cycle. What she did was call her mother in Halifax and tell her the full story, for the first time, beginning to end, without leaving anything out. She cried twice. Her mother cried once. They were on the phone for almost 2 hours, and at the end of it her mother said, You should have told me sooner. I know, Tessa said. You were trying to handle it alone. I know, she said again. That's done now, her mother said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Tessa said. That's done. The boys turned 1 in February. Owen brought balloons, the helium kind, which Eli immediately tried to eat, and Noah immediately tried to use as a weapon against Eli, which was, Tessa thought, probably an early personality preview of their entire future dynamic. Owen sat on the floor with them for 2 hours. He wasn't performing it. He wasn't making a point. He was just there. Present in the low-key, unself-conscious way that she'd come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Her mother watched him from across the room for most of the afternoon. Later, when Tessa was putting the boys down and Owen was helping Megan clean up the kitchen, her mother came to stand in the doorway of the nursery. He's good, her mother said quietly. Tessa adjusted Noah's sleep sack. I know. Does he know how good he is? Tessa thought about it. No, she said. I don't think he thinks about it. He just is. Her mother nodded, the way mothers nod when they've reached a conclusion they don't need to say out loud. At some point in the spring, Brendan's engagement to Courtney appeared in the social pages of a Toronto lifestyle magazine. There was a photograph of the two of them at some event. She was very beautiful. Her hair was very shiny. He was wearing a suit Tessa recognized because she'd been with him when he bought it. And below the photograph there was a small paragraph about the upcoming wedding, his work, his firm. There was no mention of Noah and Eli. Tessa read it once, put her phone down, and went back to the structural drawings on her desk. She had a meeting in an hour. She had a site visit on Thursday. She had 2 small boys who were currently experimenting with walking and had opinions, strong vocal opinions, about the texture of scrambled eggs. She had a mother who called every Sunday and asked detailed questions about the boys' development that she'd clearly been researching online, which was endearing. She had a sister who had given her a roof and a family when she needed it most. She had a man who read on the GO train and brought helium balloons to first birthdays, and who had 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening after the boys were asleep, taken her hand while they were sitting on Megan's back steps and not said anything at all and not needed to. She had herself. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had herself in a way that she hadn't quite in a long time. Since before the marriage, maybe. Since before she'd started quietly reshaping herself around what Brendan needed and wanted, and preferred, the small daily erosions that you don't notice until one day you sign a paper and sit in a parking lot and realize you don't recognize the shape of your own life. She recognized it now. She and Owen had a conversation in May that she'd been putting off because she knew it would change things. And she'd gotten careful about change. Careful in the way that people get after they've been through something. Not fearful, exactly, but deliberate. She'd learned the difference. She told him everything. The full version, not the edited summary she gave people when they asked. The pregnancy, the NDA, the parking lot, the 7 months of silence, the court case, all of it. They were sitting in his apartment. She'd been there enough times by then that she knew where the good mugs were, and she told it without editing and without managing his reactions. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? He said. Right now? In this moment? Yes, she said. Are you telling me this because you want me to say something specific, or because you just needed to say it out loud? She considered that. The second one, she said. He nodded. He reached over and poured more tea into her mug, which she hadn't asked for and which she needed. Okay, he said. I'm glad you told me. That was it. That was the whole thing. She'd been afraid of what would happen when she told him, and what happened was he poured her more tea and said he was glad she'd told him. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The simplicity of it. The steadiness. She had spent 6 years with someone who made her feel like her feelings were a logistical problem to be managed, and here was a person who just sat with her in them. Like it wasn't anything complicated, like it was just what you did. Noah and Eli were 14 months old when Owen met them properly. Not as their doctor, not as Mummy's friend who comes over, sometimes, but as someone who was going to be a consistent presence. She introduced him carefully on a Saturday morning and watched her sons assess this new development with the solemn gravity of very small people who have decided that some strangers are acceptable and others are not. Eli grabbed Owen's finger. Noah stared at him for a full 90 seconds, and then went back to the extremely important business of unstacking a set of wooden blocks and restacking them in a different order. "Is that a pass?" Owen said. "That's the highest praise you're going to get from Noah until he's about 3, Tessa said. "Eli's more of an optimist." "I can work with an optimist," Owen said, and let Eli grab his thumb with both hands and pull himself upright, which Eli found enormously satisfying. There was an afternoon in June when the boys were at her mother's. She'd flown down from Halifax for the week, and Tessa was sitting on her own balcony in the apartment she'd moved into that spring, the first place that was entirely and only hers, with a lease in her name and furniture she'd chosen and plants she was determined to keep alive. And she was reading, and it was quiet, and the light was good, and she thought, "I'm happy." Not relieved, not okay, not managing. Happy. It arrived quietly, the way things do when they've been building for a long time without announcing themselves. She sat with it. She let it be a real thing without immediately questioning whether she'd earned it or whether it would last or what it meant about the time before. It meant she was here. That was enough. The boys were fine. Ruth had been right. She had herself back. And somewhere across the city, Owen was finishing a Saturday shift and would call her when he was done, and she would pick up. And they would talk about nothing in particular for a long time, and that was the whole shape of it. She had signed a paper on a glass table at 9:14 in the morning, and she had cried in a parking lot, and she had given birth alone, and she had fought for her sons in a courtroom with oak paneling and a fluorescent light that buzzed slightly off-key the entire time, and she had gotten through it, not in spite of it, through it. She turned the page of her book. The light moved across the balcony floor. Somewhere down the street, a child was laughing at something very funny. Tessa listened to it and kept reading.